Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition. Today we are undertaking an in-depth exploration of the source material provided for the truly influential and, I think, groundbreaking book, The 1619 Project. A new origin story. This was created by Nikole Hannah-Jones and the New York Times.
And this is such a vital conversation. We're going to be focusing on the powerful argument that shifting the traditional founding date of the United States from 1776 back to 1619, well, it fundamentally changes how we understand the American story.
Right, and specifically the story of American democracy itself.
Exactly.
Now, before we really get into the material, we do want to thank you for listening, and please, if you can, consider subscribing for future content.
And we also want to say, after hearing this conversation, we really would encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author. It's an essential read.
Absolutely. So our exploration today centers on this core idea that 1619, the year the first enslaved Africans arrived in the English colony of Virginia, is, in fact, the true foundational date for the nation.
And how that one shift has irrevocably shaped its democracy, its economy, and its culture. We'll be breaking down how the struggle for Black freedom has somewhat paradoxically been the primary, really the main driving force in perfecting American democratic ideals.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Part 1, reestablishing the origin story. And this really begins with a highly personal revelation from the author, Nikole Hannah-Jones. She talks about a really formative experience in her childhood. She's reading a copy of a book called Before the Mayflower, A History of Black America. And in that moment, she realizes the sheer breadth of Black history that had been suppressed or just entirely ignored in her standard education.
And you have to imagine what that felt like. For her, it was an intellectual and an emotional earthquake. I mean, she describes feeling this profound sense of anger that such vital history had been kept from her.
Right, that she was being taught an incomplete story.
An incomplete and misleading story.
Yeah.
But alongside that anger was also this exhilarating sense of empowerment. Suddenly, the whole narrative of American history it expands.
Yeah.
And she developed this intense, lifelong appetite for understanding the Black American history that she'd been, starved of.
And the real breakthrough moment, the one that sparked this entire project, it all centered on a single date, 1619.
Yeah.
As she learned that African people had lived on the land that would become the United States since a ship, the White Lion, dropped anchor in Virginia that summer, she was just struck by the chronological weight of that fact.
It forces you to rethink the entire national timeline. I mean, the White Lion arrived with approximately 20 enslaved Africans in 1619. That's a full year. A whole year before the iconic ship, the Mayflower, arrived with the English separatists.
Who get all the credit.
They get all the credit. They're almost mythologically credited with starting the American experiment in 1620. So by elevating 1619, the narrative just shifts. It shifts the beginning of the American story from this idealized pursuit of religious freedom by Europeans to the brutal reality of racialized chattel slavery.
Which brings up the obvious question. So why hadn't this been common knowledge? I mean, why isn't 1619 taught right alongside the Pilgrims and Jamestown?
And that's the core realization Hannah-Jones came to. The histories we get in school, they rarely teach all the facts. They only teach certain facts.
The ones that fit the preferred story.
The ones that best support a specific, often sanitized, national mythology. And in American history, that means obscuring the foundational role of the institution of slavery. The source material brings up this crucial 2018 report by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's called Teaching Hard History.
And that report found something pretty striking. It said that even as, progressive white scholars were winning these intellectual battles in academia, this essential factual knowledge about how central slavery was, it just remained isolated from the general public.
It wasn't getting through. It just wasn't penetrating mainstream education.
And yet, and this is what's fascinating, the source material says the public instinctually knows this history matters. There was a 2019 poll referenced, and it found that 2/3 of Americans believe the legacy of slavery still affects our society today.
So they can see the effect. Even if they haven't been taught the cause, they perceive the consequence, even without understanding the causality.
Which brings us to the impact of this reframing, not just on academics, but on you, the listener, and especially on young students. When the project started to be introduced into school curricula, the feedback was, it was incredible.
It was. Black students who are so often, marginalized in traditional history classes, they reported feeling this sudden, powerful sense of ownership, a sense of belonging in and an influence over the American story.
It's not just learning facts. It's about claiming an identity within that story.
Yes. There's a really powerful quote from a student in Chicago, Arthur Griggs, who had this realization. We were the founding fathers. We put so much into the U.S. and we made the foundation.
Wow.
That kind of realization, it transforms a student from being, what, a footnote in history to being an essential architect of it.
And there's another student, Bretton Sykes, who commented that once he was aware of the full, unwhitewashed history of America, he saw things in a different light. He said he felt he had to carry myself better because I know what my ancestors went through.
That's incredible. It connects the past struggle directly to present behavior, to a sense of responsibility. And this is the core intellectual argument of the whole project. The story of the United States can't logically begin with the aspirational ideals drafted in 1776.
No, it has to begin with the reality on the ground.
It has to begin with the brutal, contradictory reality that was established in 1619, the simultaneous founding of a nation based on the promise of freedom and the mechanism of brutal racial slavery.
Oh.
We were, in a sense, born with that internal contradiction.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's move into part 2, the revolution's hypocrisy and the architecture of slavery. The source material argues that while the revolution is, heralded as this great fight for liberty, it was fundamentally fought under a banner of what it calls white exclusivity.
And that's the bitter irony, isn't it? The white founders, they often use slavery as a political metaphor. You hear it all the time in their writings. They claim they were being enslaved by the British Crown's taxes or regulations.
Which is a pretty loaded metaphor to use when you yourself are an enslaver.
Incredibly loaded. And by doing this, they normalize the term, but crucially, they ensure that actual abolition ending the real thing would never be considered a revolutionary cause alongside independence.
And the consequences of making that choice were massive.
They were devastating. I mean, think about it. Because abolition wasn't integral to the fight for independence. The true institution of chattel slavery, the actual enslavement of millions of human beings, it endured for nearly another century after the revolution was over.
They chose political unity over human liberty?
They chose political unity and the economic protection for slaveholders over human liberty for all. That was the choice.
Geographically, the source material really puts Virginia at the center of all this. It wasn't just a colony, it was the colony, right?
Absolutely. Virginia was the oldest, it was the largest, the wealthiest, and the most influential colony in British North America. And so consequently, it was the one most heavily shaped by and reliant on slavery.
So its needs and its fears would have dictated the national conversation.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
When we look at the primary authors of the foundational documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they were almost all enslavers, and most of the early presidents were Virginians. Their reality dictated the national reality.
And this leads to a really challenging, I think for some people, a provocative claim. The claim that many founders sought independence in 1776, specifically to defend their rights to own slaves. How does the source material back that up?
Well, the sources argue that independence wasn't just about abstract liberty. It was also about protecting a very lucrative economic institution from British interference.
So a business decision.
In many ways, yes. Britain had been moving, slowly, but moving toward abolition. There were court cases in England that were worrying American enslavers. They saw independence as the only sure way to safeguard their property, their human property, and ensure the continuity of their labor system against any potential decrees from London.
So protecting the economic engine of slavery was a primary, if often unspoken, motivation for many of the Southern patriots.
That's the argument. Now, here's where things get really interesting, because the enslaved black population actively shifted the course of the revolution, just not in the way the patriots wanted.
Right. They saw their own opportunity for freedom.
Correct. Resistance by enslaved people was constant, but there was one specific military and political act that changed the entire game. Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, he issued a proclamation in 1775.
And this document did what exactly?
It offered freedom to any enslaved person who belonged to a patriot. So, anyone fighting the British, if they fled their enslaver and joined the British Ethiopian Regiment.
That is a stunning tactical move, and it must have been incredibly effective.
It was. Thousands fled their plantations to seek refuge with the British. It forced the Patriots to fight two wars at the same time. One against the professional British Army, and another, a sort of internal war, against their own enslaved population who were seeking liberation.
It exposed the lie at the heart of their own rhetoric.
Completely. And we have to remember, Dunmore himself was no abolitionist. He owned slaves. He was using emancipation purely as a military weapon, a strategy that, as the sources note, mirrors Abraham Lincoln's use of emancipation almost 90 years later during the Civil War.
Right. It wasn't a moral crusade, it was a war tactic.
Exactly. Enslaved people weren't loyal to a crown or a flag. They were loyal to whichever side offered the clearest path to freedom.
And the founders clearly saw this as a massive threat. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, when he drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he initially tried to include language that blamed the King of England for forcing slavery onto the colonies.
He did. And crucially, he railed against the crown for stoking insurrections by the enslaved, which was a direct reference to Dunmore's actions. He was furious that the British were weaponizing the desire for freedom among people he and others were enslaving.
But that passage was cut.
It was struck down by the other congressmen before the declaration was finalized. And this just shows the immediate prioritization of unity and the protection of slaveholding over confronting the glaring hypocrisy at the nation's birth. The right to exploit human labor was deemed non-negotiable.
So once independence was won, the leaders had to legally cement this racial hierarchy into the new nation's framework. We know that by the time the Constitution was written, something like 40% of Virginia's population was enslaved. How did they use legal architecture to guarantee white profit and power?
The legal framework became the steel cage for racial oppression. The Constitution itself had mechanisms like the Three-Fifths Compromise, but this thinking was fully and brutally enshrined in the 1857 Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott decision.
Okay, for a listener, you've probably heard of Dred Scott, but the core holding of that case is often simplified. What did the Supreme Court legally declare about Black people?
The court, which was led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, ruled that Black people, whether they were enslaved or nominally free, they were not and could never be citizens of the United States.
Never. Not just at that moment, but ever.
Ever. Furthermore, the court declared that Black people were permanently inferior to white people, incompatible with American life, and had, and I quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. It was the ultimate judicial stamp of approval on racial hierarchy. It basically said that Black people came from a slave race and were therefore incapable of citizenship. It made racist ideology the supreme law of the land.
And the roots of this legal architecture go back even further, right to the start of the colonies.
Yeah.
We need to talk about this. This complex, horrifying legal term, partus sequitur ventrum. Can you break down what that means and how it functioned as a mechanism for generating wealth?
Partus sequitur ventrum. It's Latin, and it means that which is brought forth follows the belly.
Mm-hmm.
Or, more simply, the legal status of a child follows the status of the mother.
Okay.
In 1664, Maryland enacted a law establishing this principle. Now, before this, some European traditions held that a child's status followed the father, or that only white men could be property owners.
But this new law, it did something incredibly sinister, specifically for the slaveholders.
It did. Its terrifying practical effect was twofold. First, it guaranteed that the children of enslaved women, even those children conceived through rape or sexual coercion by white men, would be born into perpetual slavery. This secured a continuous heritable source of labor, and therefore white profit. The womb of the enslaved woman became the primary source of new capital.
It's an economic technology disguised as law.
Perfectly put. And second, the same laws often criminalized Black, mulatto, and Indian men from marrying or having relationships with white women. But white men's sexual access to enslaved Black women was unrestricted. This ensured racial purity for the white lineage while simultaneously generating endless wealth through the brutal exploitation of Black women's bodies.
So when we move from the legal foundations to the economic engine of the country, that brings us to part 3, economics, labor, and the global reach of cotton. The source material focuses so intensely on the critical and violent role of the cotton kingdom.
The explosion of cotton production in the South after 1800 was transformative. Cotton became the single most valuable and widely traded commodity in the entire world. It didn't just enrich Southern planters, it fueled the rise of factories, massive manufacturing enterprises, and industrial workforces across the globe, from Manchester, England to New England.
The U.S. became a global economic superpower on the back of this one crop.
It did. And the source material asks a really compelling question. Why did the U.S. succeed with cotton in a way that other regions with similar climates couldn't replicate? It wasn't just because of the invention of the cotton gin.
Right, that's the simple story we're often told.
But the sources argue the key factor was America's unflinching willingness to use violence on non-white people and to exert its will on seemingly endless supplies of land and labor. This industrialized scale of violence made the U.S. cotton economy uniquely competitive on a global scale. It wasn't about the efficiency of machinery, but the efficiency of brutality. That's what drove the market.
So let's break that down. Slavery as a management system, because the profit was directly tied to the scale and precision of that brutality.
It was a meticulously crafted system designed to extract the absolute maximum output through anguish. The horrifying reality was that enslaved people were beaten if they picked too little cotton. But, and here's the insidious twist, they were also often punished or they suffered severe personal misery if they overshot their picking target by too much.
Wait, why would you punish success? That doesn't make sense.
Because if an enslaved person showed that they could pick, say, 200 pounds in a day, an overseer would immediately raise their required quota, their picking rate, to that new, unsustainable level for the next day and the day after that. Success was instantly weaponized against them. It guaranteed that the maximum possible productivity was extracted, regardless of the human cost.
That is just a staggering example of how cruelty was industrialized and codified into a business practice. And we can see how these localized punishments were tied directly to the global capitalist system.
It was a direct cash value transaction placed on moral commitments. Punishments literally rose and fell with global market fluctuations. A fugitive from slavery, a man named John Brown, he wrote about this in 1854, and he articulated the connection starkly. He said, "When the price rises in the English market, the poor slaves immediately feel the effects, for they are harder driven, and the whip is kept more constantly going."
So when a textile mill in England placed a large order, the cost was paid not just in shillings, but in the intensified suffering of an enslaved person in Mississippi. That's the link.
That's the intimate, violent link between global finance and local exploitation. And this massive racialized system of labor had profound and lasting negative consequences on the wider American working class and the growth of things like labor protections.
So how did it damage the labor movement as a whole?
Well, slavery and the deep institutional racism it created play a decisive role in weakening the American labor movement for generations. Capitalists were extremely clever. They leveraged the racial division to separate workers, pitting free white workers against unfree black workers. This diluted their collective bargaining power and prevented the formation of a unified working class that could demand better wages and conditions for everyone.
You would think that poor white workers, many of whom were losing their farms to these huge plantation owners, would recognize the common economic enemy. But the source material suggests they were given a form of compensation instead.
They were. They were offered what the sources call whiteness as consolation. American freedom became defined very narrowly as simply the opposite of bondage. This understanding made all non-slavery appear as freedom, even for poor white workers who were being severely exploited by the very same capitalists and planters.
So what did that compensation look like in practical terms?
The poor white farmers, the yeomen, they might lose their land, face crushing debt, and struggle economically. But they retained their whiteness. And this whiteness was positioned as a form of freedom, of status, of legal protection that inoculated them from the ultimate degradation and legal non-existence of chattel slavery.
So it gave them someone to look down on.
It gave them a floor they couldn't fall beneath. And this privilege left them unwilling to ally with black workers, whether free or enslaved. The result was a labor movement that remained fractured, racially divided, and significantly weaker than it could have been.
It's crucial to trace how these foundations from 1619 continue to underpin modern American life. And that brings us to part 4, the pervasive legacy in modern systems. Let's start with justice and policing. The argument is made that modern policing has its origins firmly planted in the necessity of slave control.
That historical DNA is, it's undeniable. It started with laws designed to establish that black people required perpetual surveillance. The very same year that Partus Sequitur Ventrum was codified, 1664, officials in Maryland enacted another law requiring white people to police black people enslaved or free.
So it made every white person a part of the enforcement system.
Yes, it set the legal precedent that black people were inherently devious and criminal and required a specialized form of state control. And this was formalized through what were known as slave codes.
And what was the scope of these codes? What did they cover?
They were comprehensive laws that literally governed every single aspect of a black person's life. They denied them basic human rights, they forbade literacy, they prevented them from gathering in groups, and they established a system of perpetual surveillance and immediate brutal punishment. The entire framework was designed to permanently subdue the enslaved population, protect the financial investment of the slaveholders, and ensure the safety of the white citizenry from the massive population they were oppressing.
And the fear of Black resistance was constant. We see that fear translated directly into policy. The sources mention the Stono Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina.
Right, where 20 enslaved Africans, led by a man named Jemmy, they plotted a revolt and killed over 20 white people before they were defeated by a white militia. That kind of uprising just solidified the need for extreme, overwhelming control. And even after the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery, the mechanism of control simply adapted. It didn't disappear.
It changed its name.
Exactly. States implemented vagrancy laws.
And how did these vagrancy laws effectively recreate slavery?
They were selectively enforced almost exclusively against Black people. A vagrancy law essentially made it a criminal offense not to work or to be unemployed. So Black people were arrested for minor or completely fabricated infractions like loitering or talking back, and then they were fined.
Fines they couldn't possibly pay.
Of course not. So they were leased out to plantations, to mines, or industrial enterprises under long-term contracts. This system was known as peonage or convict leasing. It forced formerly enslaved individuals right back into labor contracts that were almost identical to slavery, and often under even more brutal conditions, because the state had no financial investment in the longevity of the worker.
That is such a direct line from the slave codes to modern incarceration and systemic surveillance. And we see modern echoes of this legacy, too. The source material highlights the really stark contrast in policing responses in just the last few years.
I mean, think about the violence that followed George Floyd's death. You had this wave of brutal repression against racial justice protesters. Then contrast that with the images from the January 6th Capitol insurrection, where police presence was light and officers were, in many cases, seen letting the largely white crowd of insurrectionists advance and storm the building.
The difference in enforcement isn't just a logistical failure, it reflects a centuries-old pattern. The source material also references that viral incident where a white woman in Central Park falsely called the police, claiming a Black man, Christian Cooper, was endangering her.
And that specific incident is described as know-your-place aggression. It's rooted not in a fear of actual Black crime, but in the systemic, centuries-old white fear of Black liberation and Black autonomy. The power to summon the apparatus of state violence against a Black person simply for existing in a space is a direct inheritance of the master-slave dynamic.
Let's shift to health and medical abuse, which the sources argue is another system where racial bias was formulated during slavery and persists even today.
Yes, the medical establishment played a huge role in underwriting slavery. Starting in the antebellum period, physicians actively sought to scientifically prove that Black bodies were fundamentally different and inferior to white bodies.
They created a biological justification for cruelty.
They did. They fabricated theories arguing that enslaved Africans were biologically fit for forced labor, that they could withstand harsher treatment. They were trying to declare the institution of slavery neither immoral nor cruel, but natural.
And the most egregious example provided is that of J. Marion Sims, who is often called the father of modern gynecology.
Sims' work it's horrifying.
Okay.
Between 1845 and 1849, he conducted repeated, painful surgical experiments on enslaved Black women in Alabama. We know the names of 3 of them: Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, without anesthesia.
Without anesthesia.
Without anesthesia. He was trying to cure obstetric complications like vesicovaginal fistulas. He performed these surgeries because the prevailing racist medical view held that Black people had a higher pain tolerance and that their bodies were essentially disposable research subjects. His innovations, which are celebrated in medicine, were built on unconscionable torture.
And this established a profound and completely justified distrust that continued well into the 20th century, most notably with the Tuskegee syphilis study.
That study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, epitomizes the ongoing systemic abuse. 600 Black men in Alabama, many with syphilis, were told they were receiving free medical care. But what researchers were actually doing was observing them for 4 decades as their syphilis progressed and their health deteriorated.
And they withheld treatment.
They actively withheld treatment. In the 1940s, penicillin became the established, effective cure for syphilis, yet the government actively prevented the participants from accessing it for decades just to continue the observation study.
Yeah.
It confirmed for many Black Americans that the medical establishment simply could not be trusted with their lives.
And the sources connect this history to modern health disparities and a truly profound and disturbing irony, especially regarding the sugar industry.
Right. The enormous wealth generated by the brutal forced labor of the enslaved was the foundation of the massive sugar industry in the Americas. And today, that same industry provides unhealthy, mass consumption foods that take the greatest toll on Black communities. who suffer from higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and related chronic illnesses.
And that disparity is made worse by residential segregation, which is another direct legacy of slavery.
Yes, segregation creates what are known as food deserts areas, usually low-income neighborhoods, where supermarkets and access to healthy, fresh produce are scarce. This forces a reliance on cheaper, sugary processed foods. The source material cites a study in Topeka, Kansas, that found low-income white neighborhoods were twice as likely to have a food store as black ones.
So the historical racial segregation continues to dictate environmental factors that diminish health outcomes today.
It's all connected. Which brings us to Part V, the fight for citizenship and the myth of progress.
Right, because the central paradox of the 1619 Project is that despite all of this systematic, pervasive oppression, Black Americans actively led the charge to define and secure freedom and citizenship in the U.S.
This relentless struggle for rights is what has repeatedly advanced the entire American concept of democracy.
And this struggle was organized very early on through something called the Colored Conventions movement.
This movement started in Philadelphia in 1830, and it continued for decades. It was a series of formal meetings of black leaders dedicated to political advancement. They promoted abolition, education, commerce, and they actively debated and articulated a theory of birthright citizenship and civil rights even before the Civil War. They were forging a robust, comprehensive African-American political agenda that pushed the boundaries of what America claimed to be.
Leaders like Frederick Douglass were central to this. He emphasized that even a guarantee of citizenship was just a fragile milestone. It had to carry with it the rights of citizens, which he defined, above all, as the right to vote.
And that resistance was transformative. The passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, which established birthright citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed black male suffrage, those were not gifts from white America.
No, they were hard-won victories.
They were essential milestones born directly from black resistance and this decades-long struggle for national belonging and political recognition.
Unfortunately, as soon as these gains were achieved, they were met with a swift and violent political and social backlash. This was the dismantling of multiracial democracy during and after Reconstruction.
Resistance was overwhelming, and it was multifaceted. It included unthinkable violence against the formerly enslaved population, widespread voter suppression, electoral fraud, and, critically, the violent overthrow of democratically elected biracial governments.
And the federal government eventually just gave up.
They did. Fatigued from the Civil War and politically unwilling to maintain oversight, the federal government ultimately succumbed to this violent white recalcitrance.
And the legal manifestation of this retreat was the passage of Jim Crow laws, which codified segregation in ridiculous, often arbitrary detail.
The segregation wasn't subtle, it was comprehensive. I mean, we're talking about laws mandating separate phone booths in Memphis, separate parking spaces, ordinances that made it illegal for a black person to move onto a block that was more than half white.
And Alabama had laws barring black people from using public libraries that their own tax dollars had paid for.
Exactly. These systems established a caste system that ensured the racial hierarchy was cemented into every single facet of public life.
And this history creates and perpetuates what the sources refer to as the myth of inevitable progress.
And this myth is extremely dangerous. It's dangerous because it simplifies history, suggesting that racial progress is unstoppable and linear, just always moving forward since 1619. This narrative is then weaponized. If progress is inevitable, the logic goes, then any current black struggle must be their own fault, not the result of ongoing systemic racism.
We see that logic used explicitly in legal challenges to black advancement.
Absolutely. The myth of progress was used by the Supreme Court back in 1883 to strike down the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Justice Joseph P. Bradley argued that there must be a stage when a formerly enslaved man ceases to be the special favorite of the laws.
So they twisted the request for equitable treatment into a claim of special preference.
Exactly. The demand to be treated equally under the law was reframed as asking for special undue favoritism.
And we see that identical rhetoric used much more recently to dismantle federal protection for voting rights.
Yes, in 2013, the Shelby County v. Holder Supreme Court decision drastically cut federal oversight in the Voting Rights Act. Chief Justice Roberts argued that the conditions that originally justified the act no longer characterize voting in those areas because, and I quote, things have changed dramatically.
The myth of progress.
It's the same logic. This reliance on the rhetoric of inevitable progress, which often prioritizes political convenience over factual reality, enables states like Georgia and Arizona to immediately start restricting voting access right after the 2020 election. It demonstrates how fragile democratic gains are without constant vigilance.
Before we move on to the question of reparations, we need to touch on the complicated intersection of Black and Native American histories. They share a deep history of oppression and displacement under the same colonial system.
It's so vital to acknowledge that indigenous people were also subjected to racialized enslavement by Anglo colonists. Historians estimate somewhere between 30,000 to 50,000 indigenous Southerners were enslaved before 1715. They were traded widely, often alongside African captives, creating an American diaspora that traversed the same auction blocks and transatlantic routes.
But the relationship became much more complex, especially when the U.S. government stepped in with what it called its civilization policy.
Right. This policy, which was conceived by white enslavers, essentially held the expectation that the most progressive Native American leaders, those who wanted to integrate into American society, should also adopt race slavery themselves.
So they saw owning Black people as a sign of being civilized.
They viewed it as a defining characteristic of civilized American life and economic success. The example cited in the book is a man named James Vann, a wealthy Cherokee, who established a large cotton estate and enslaved over 100 Black people. He was aligning himself with American-style race slavery to gain political favor and recognition from the government.
And tragically, this alignment was used to facilitate the greatest expansion of the Cotton Kingdom.
The Indian Removal Act was, in essence, the war that the slaveholders won. The forced expulsion of the Cherokee, the Creek, and other tribal nations cleared these vast, fertile tracts of land in the Deep South. This massive land grab immediately allowed Southern enslavers to expand chattel slavery onto former native lands, an expansion that far surpassed any native adoption of slavery in its intensity and its extent.
So the expulsion of Native peoples was made plausible because of the precedent set by the forced migration and exploitation of African peoples.
That's the tragic connection.
So we've established this deep historical, legal, and economic debt that slavery created. Let's look at the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. This brings us to part 6, the debt that remains, reparations and economic justice. This was the one time when reparations were seriously considered, and it's also the story of why that promise ultimately failed.
That moment came in early 1865. General Sherman issued Special Order Number 15, which is the origin of the famous 40 acres and a mule promise. This order allocated confiscated Confederate land along the Georgia and South Carolina coast, particularly the Sea Islands, for settlement by newly freed families. It was a tangible, material offering that could have provided a real chance at economic self-sufficiency.
But that promise was almost immediately broken.
It was tragically short-lived. The order was overturned by President Andrew Johnson, the racist, pro-Southern vice president who took office after Lincoln's assassination. Johnson immediately reneged on the order. He confiscated the land back from the newly freed families who had just started cultivating it, and he returned it to the white enslavers,
Wiping out the first, and really the best, opportunity for Black economic footing in the nation.
He did. And the historical irony here isn't just that the promise failed, it's that the only Americans who ever received government restitution for slavery were, in fact, white enslavers in Washington, D.C.
Wait, say that again?
The federal government compensated white enslavers in D.C. for the loss of their human property after the Civil War. This act fundamentally codified the notion that the property rights of the enslavers were sacred, while the right of the formerly enslaved to material resources and compensation for their forced labor was completely dismissed.
So this failure to provide material resources meant that the civil rights laws passed a century later, in the 1960s, could never correct centuries of accumulated economic harm.
That's the absolute crux of the reparations argument. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. acknowledged this precise dilemma shortly before his death. He posed the critical question, what good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger?
Ending legal segregation didn't magically compensate Black Americans for generations of legally sanctioned wage theft, exclusion from land ownership, and denied housing opportunities.
Not at all. And the persistence of inequality today, even among high earners, is just staggering evidence of this accumulated harm.
What does the data show?
The research demonstrates that Black families earning $75,000 or more per year still live in neighborhoods that are poorer and have lower levels of resources than white Americans earning less than $40,000 per year.
Wow.
It shows that residential segregation patterns, inherited lack of wealth due to centuries of exclusion from things like FHA loans and the GI Bill, these systemic barriers remain stubbornly intact. High individual earnings do not inoculate Black people against racialized disadvantage.
So what does the source material conclude is the actual obstacle to rectification, specifically regarding reparations? Is it that calculating the debt is too complicated?
No. The sources are clear that the technical details of calculating and administering restitution are manageable. We calculate historical losses all the time in other contexts. The real and so far insurmountable obstacle that the nation has never overcome is political will. It's the difficulty in convincing enough Americans that restitution is owed for the centuries-long forced economic disadvantage created by slavery and its subsequent legal legacies.
And they use a compelling contemporary contrast to illustrate where national will already exists, showing that the capacity for generosity is there when a consensus is reached.
They do. They point out that the U.S. Congress annually allocates millions of dollars to help support Holocaust survivors living in America. And this demonstrates that when the political will exists, when a moral and political consensus recognizes a historical debt owed for monumental injustices, the nation is perfectly capable of organizing and providing restitution.
So the source argues that nationalized amnesia, or the myth of inevitable progress, can no longer serve as an excuse not to address the crime.
That's the argument.
As we conclude this intensive exploration of the 1619 Project, the central takeaway for me is just so clear. The history of the United States is inseparable from the history of Black Americans, and understanding America requires acknowledging 1619, not just the sanitized version that starts in 1776.
And the source material really forces us to recognize that the ongoing struggle for Black freedom is not ancillary to the American story. It is central to the nation's identity and its democratic evolution. Every expansion of rights, from the 14th Amendment to the Voting Rights Act, has been driven by Black resistance, pushing the nation closer to its stated ideals.
And that tradition of resistance, the sources remind us, began early, and it began violently. Leaders like Gabriel Prosser, who plotted an insurrection with the motto, "Death or Liberty," and David Walker, who called on enslaved people to liberate themselves through violence. They reveal that the fight for American ideals, true freedom and equality, has often been waged against the nation's foundational hypocrisy.
In this history, it demands that we reconsider our national narratives. It asks us to understand that we can't change the past, but acknowledging the crime and working toward material rectification is the only way to genuinely embrace the promise of American democracy for all its people.
The goal of this conversation was to help you become well-informed on this essential, complex history and the profound arguments put forth by Nikole Hannah-Jones and her contributors. We hope this exploration encourages you to continue learning, to question the accepted narrative, and to remember that the struggle for equality, driven by the resistance that began in 1619, has been the greatest force for good in American history.
Thank you for joining us for this mini book podcast, African American Books Edition.
We'll see you next time.